verbal behavior if you're interested in that topic. We have breakout sessions that we'll do on Friday, so it's Thursday and Friday. All of the breakout sessions will be offered more than once. So if you feel like you have to choose between two people that you really want to see, you're not going to miss one. You can choose the one person, and then in the afternoon, you can see that person again. So I encourage you to go to the MSLBD website and check out the conference flyer. I had some printed copies on the table out in the foyer before you came in, so you can get all of the information there. Our preliminary program, which is pretty much 100% complete at this point, is also there, so you can see who all the speakers are, the keynotes, the workshops, and all that jazz. So I hope you don't mind me the hard sell on that conference. I'm really excited about it, and we're looking for nominees for an Outstanding Teacher Award. And those are going to be due in a few weeks, actually. So that information for the nominations is on the MSLBD website. So we would really like to get a good group of nominees and recognize an outstanding teacher in the area of autism. So anybody who serves children with autism in a classroom or in a related service role or a supervisory role are all eligible for the award. So the second plug has to do with the online programs at KU. I'm the coordinator for the online, all of the autism programs there. We have 2 online programs, a certificate program that is 13 credits. It's 4 3-credit courses and a 1-credit field experience that if you're teaching in a classroom, you can easily do it in your classroom. And that's a graduate certificate program. We also have a master's degree in special education with an emphasis on autism. That includes 5 classes that are autism-specific courses and the other elective courses. You can take elective courses in, are we working? So do I need this? Should I have this? Good job. Just in time for the KU plug too. So we have these online programs, and the master's degree program has 3 elective tracks, including a behavior track, so you can take some courses specific to behavior, transition for the secondary folks, or leadership and inclusion. And there'll be 3 elective courses in addition to some other requirements, a families course, a research course, and that sort of thing. And I've recently been partnering with folks in the Applied Behavior Sciences Department, and some of our students in the online master's degree program have decided to take their courses to get the BCBA through the ABS department there. So we can use those courses to fit your elective requirement, and you can sort of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You can email me if you're interested, or I'll chat with you after the show. Don't be shy. Okay, so tonight's talk, and please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions at any point. My talk tonight is about curriculum standards. And some of you may be thinking like, well, why is it important to link IEP goals to curriculum standards? What is the purpose of doing this? Is this just some, satisfying the IEP gods? Then I have to kind of go through this painful process of identifying standards that match with, my students' goals, and why should I? It's already a lot of work. Why should I do this? So I want to give you sort of a background on why I think this is an important task. And I also think that by the end of the night, you'll see it's really not that much work once you figure out how to do it. And I hope to show you that process. So the first reason is just your ethical obligation to students with disabilities. Every kid with an IEP has a finite amount of time to access education. At some point, those services are no longer going to be available. So in some sense, every minute really matters. If you think about 10 minutes of instructional time lost per day, for whatever reason, use of ineffective practice, or inadequate planning, or you have another kid who's having a meltdown and is just totally disruptive, that 10 minutes in that day may not seem like a significant amount of time. But if that occurs regularly, that amount of time can accrue to something very substantial. And essentially what we're doing when we fail to identify and link the goals of our instruction with the state standards, we're sort of avoiding our ethical obligation to demonstrate that we're making good use of that student's time. That we're spending the student's time wisely in a way that's going to be beneficial to them. So in some sense, linking IEP goals to curriculum standards provides is supported by an ethical obligation to serve students in the best way possible, to make good use of their limited amount of time to access education. The second issue is accountability. We are, as special educators and teachers generally, are persistently being tasked with meeting increased expectations for performance, student performance standards, student growth, student achievement, student outcomes. And even though you all are consistently and persistently asked to do more and more, it's relatively often that you're also asked to do it with less and less. So in some sense, we have to demonstrate to the people who hold the dollar bills that we're doing the right thing, that we're benefiting our students. And when people look at the data and they see that students with disabilities have poor employment outcomes, for example, they may wonder, well, why are we investing in these programs? Why should we spend more money on these programs when students are not performing or achieving some expected standards? So for accountability purposes, to hold ourselves accountable, but also to demonstrate that we have been accountable to the politicians, to our fellow citizens, members of the community, and to other teachers, we should link IEP goals to performance standards to convince them that it's worth their time, it's worth their resources, that special education has a purpose, and it's better to invest in special education than it is to not. Do I need both, or just, you got the wrong one? Just do both? I can do that. It's like I have 3 daughters at home, so I'm no stranger to wearing multiple necklaces. Let's see here. So other reasons. Narrow in terms of their content. You know, I think many times you're like sitting at home, because you work at home, you're doing your IEP, you're writing your IEP at home, because when you're at work, you're actually teaching kids and you don't have the time to write them at school, but you're trying to come up with, well, what does this kid need to learn? What does this kid need to know? What can I turn to? What resources do I have? And maybe you turn to it like a curriculum manual, and that's great, but the standards could fill that void too. The standards can inform the development of IEP goals. It's sort of a two-way street. You can identify what the student needs based on your observations, your data collection, assessment, and that sort of thing. You say, oh, I see the student ought to be able to do these things, and he's not doing that, or he's doing, he's engaging in some severe behavior, and I need him to be more compliant, need him to communicate more. Those things are very tangible. They're very easy to identify because they're the sorts of things that you're seeing every day. There's a very salient thing about severe behavior, communication impairments, functional daily living skills. Like, you can list all of those generally pretty easily, but maybe you're prioritizing those sorts of skills over other skills that might benefit the student in unique and unpredicted ways. So using the standards may help you provide a more broader or comprehensive education program. It may better prepare the student for post-school life, which is the purpose of education. So get them ready for adulthood, post-secondary education, or employment, independent living. And I think one thing that we may overlook is the importance of exposing students to a broad array of experiences. We get used to doing what we do as teachers. Our routines, our schedule, our expectations, And it may be that science instruction is not on your high list of priorities. And you may rationalize that to yourself and say, this kid wouldn't benefit from science instruction. This kid couldn't benefit from science instruction, or it's just not as important. But and I totally get that argument. You have to prioritize. You can't do everything. But how do you know if something is going to provide an enriching experience in that student's life? You may discover an interest in a student that they didn't even know they had. So in some sense, including curriculum standards may broaden your programming and therefore broaden the student's exposure to a variety of experiences. And we know kids with autism and developmental disabilities, especially those with severe behavior, the way that people cope and deal with severe behavior is by increasingly restricting exposure to other experiences. I can't take them out into the community. I can't take them out into the gymnasium. We can't go here, we can't go there, we can't do this, we can't go out to a restaurant as a family. And we just start restricting the student's experience, their quality of life diminishes. And what do you think that does to their severe behavior? Yeah, it's going to increase their severe behavior. But that's our way of responding to it. So if we think about severe behavior may be related to low quality of life, reduced access to enriching life experiences, then one potential solution might be to integrate more of those sorts of experiences such that the student can, so that you can recognize whether a student actually enjoys this topic. There's a great paper, maybe I'll put it in that Dropbox, by a colleague and friend of mine named Kevin Ayers at the University of Georgia. And the title of the paper is, "I Can Identify Saturn, but I Can't Brush My Teeth." And it's sort of about this tension between our standards-based movement and the movement towards teaching academics or prioritizing academic standards over functional ones, functional goals, and what happens when, what happens to functional and daily living and sort of uniquely enriching experiences for that student are restricted. So I encourage you to take a look at that paper. I think the flip side of that argument, and I've had this argument with Kevin over beers, is how do you know until you try that this kid is not, if you expose the kid to astronomy, maybe 9 out of 10 kids are going to, they're just not going to enjoy it. But there could be one kid who becomes very much interested in that topic, and it develops as a new special interest area that you can exploit and integrate all sorts of instruction around. But you would never know that if you never exposed the student to that curriculum. All right. Yeah, so this is good rationale. Let's get to the meat. I don't know if you can see this, but that's a coffee cup for IEP prep, and it's a wine glass for IEP recovery. Oh, I thought that was great. I just found that, and I thought, how do I order those? I bet those would make great gifts. So I've been thinking for quite a while. I've worked as an expert witness for several due process cases and a couple of civil cases, and inevitably what I'm asked to do is look at the child's educational programming, their IEPs, and determine whether there was meaningful educational benefit. And what I tend to find are IEPs that don't really demonstrate any progress. Sometimes they have the same goals and objectives year after year. Student didn't make progress, so we're going to keep working on it. Student didn't make progress, we're going to keep working on it. That's not a good, I would advise against doing that. But more importantly is just this sort of disdain that we've developed around the IEP. It is a pain in the ass to write them. I completely agree. And there's all this red tape and bureaucratic stuff, and all of the legal obligations seem to have become prioritized over the practical value of the IEP. It's supposed to be a helpful document, but it's become this checklist, this task that we just need to get off our desk so we can go back to doing the things that really matter. But the IEP should be useful. you should be able to turn to it and say, oh yeah, that's what I'm doing. This is what we're supposed to be doing now. This is where we're going next. This is how we're doing it. But it doesn't really happen that way. It should be coherent. The goals and related objectives should be tied to a curriculum. The curriculum standards are a good way to demonstrate that, but maybe you have a curriculum that you use that's separate from that, like the Brigance or the Syracuse, or like that one. But there should be some linearity, there's some relationship between the different components of the IEP. If you think about the goals that you select, those should be based on the curriculum, and the curriculum is just a menu. It's like, oh, these are the things that I could teach. It's like a buffet. Who doesn't love a good buffet? I'm from Las Vegas. Who doesn't love a good buffet? I'm not talking about Golden Corral. I'm talking about like the Mirage, the MGM, the $40, $45 buffet. Different stations, and you can pick and choose. That's what a curriculum manual is. And usually they're organized in a systematic way, a stepwise fashion that you can sort of just go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. This makes sense. Building, advancing. Menus may vary considerably, but the standards are the menu that the state has decided is important. These are the things that must be taught. We should relate our present levels, our goals and objectives and related services to specially designed instruction. All of these things should be logical, related, and obvious. But often they're not. Often you get something that looks a little bit like this. I don't know how well you can see this, but practically useless IEP. So I looked at, this is just one IEP that I looked at for a case in which there were 5 annual IEPs and several addendums that I looked at. And I went through and I identified each of the goals and the related objectives, and then I assigned them to a domain. And then I looked at the percent of objectives that related to the present levels of performance and the number of minutes in specially designed instruction. Okay. So in this IEP for communication, there were in the IEP, there were 49 objectives total. 14 of them were related to communication. So that's 29% of the IEP's objectives were about communication. This was a girl with autism, moderate impairments, attending a specialized school in a very large school district. So although 29% of the objectives were related to communication, only 200 minutes per week out of 1,800 minutes in the school week, only 200 of those minutes were related to teaching those communication goals. Now that's a big red flag for me, because a kid with autism who has a moderate intellectual impairment that's attending a specialized school, the bulk of their instruction probably should be focused on teaching the person how to communicate. And yet only 200 minutes or 11% of their day is spent on communication. Now if you go down to reading, where she was getting allegedly 400 minutes per week of specially designed instruction for reading, there was not a single IEP objective related to reading. The attorneys are getting happy, at least the ones that hire me. When they see this stuff, they can see the accountability is practically absent. I mean, how can you have 0 objectives for social skills instruction for a kid with autism who's getting 250 minutes per week of specially designed instruction for social skills? It doesn't make sense. So if you think about goals related to present levels, the number of objectives that relate to these domains, academic and functional domains, and the number of minutes that you provide, as well as related services and accommodations and all those things, there should be some consistency there. And oftentimes there's not, at least not in the case where I'm called in. Right? So this means we can't it's difficult to hold the school accountable because we don't know what was taught, what wasn't taught, we don't know what was, whether needs were being met. All we can say is this IEP was not reasonably designed to provide educational benefit. That's a claim about an absence of an effect. So essentially what I have to do is try to convince people that something that should have happened didn't happen. Can you imagine what instruction looks like when you have an IEP that looks this? What is your reading curriculum when you don't have any reading related objectives, but you're teaching reading for 400 minutes per week? I don't know. That's a good question to ask the other side. Right? But this all should all make sense, and oftentimes it doesn't. It's very arbitrary, I've noticed in IEPs. They're like, oh yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, I think that's right. Standards, I think, can help us clarify what we're doing and how we're planning. Okay, so the takeaway here is only 13 of the 49 IEP objectives were linked to present levels of performance. You can't have an objective if it's not related to a present level of performance. We don't know what the kid is doing now. We don't know what the kid should be doing next. If it doesn't have an objective tied to it, then it probably can't have a goal tied to it, which means we can't connect it to some expectation, which means we can't hold anybody accountable for doing their job. Only 2 of the goals were linked to a standard, any standard, and 46 of 49 objectives were poorly written, meaning that they're immeasurable goals. They were lacking either in an observable, measurable behavior, they didn't have a condition, or they didn't have a criteria for mastery. Right, so writing a good IEP is important, and writing goals that relate to standards is one way of clarifying what we're going to do for how much, where, and all the other related details. So that was the bad news, but the good news is you don't have to make this stuff up. The work is already done. The menus are already out there. You just have to go and get them. I have until 7:30, right? Okay. Had a little panic there for a second. Thought I only had 30 minutes left. Yeah, the work is already done. The curriculum reflects what we believe as a community, as a society, is going to benefit the individual. So when we talk about academic standards, they're not just arbitrary expectations to appease the politicians and the education gods. They're really supposed to be reflections of what we value in a society and what we think people need to know in order to be successful and have meaningful participation in democracy. So sometimes we may look at the standards and say, that's a little much. That's unrealistic. That doesn't apply to my kids. But the reality is, there is some way for you to work towards that expectation. Maybe your student is never going to read Shakespeare and enjoy it. Maybe they're never going to read Shakespeare at all. Maybe they're not going to really read advanced literature, but it's something to work towards. Literature is important because it's enriching. Many people find it valuable. But if you don't know that you like literature because you've never been exposed to any sort of literature, then how can you benefit from it? How would you know that you like Korean barbecue if you didn't even know that was a thing? Like, barbecue is something we have. There's like Kansas City, there's Kansas barbecue, there's Texas barbecue, there's Carolina barbecue. We all know which one is the best. But we never, this Korean thing, that's new. I never heard of that before. So do I like that? I don't know. I can go try it and I can find out. And maybe I discover the second best barbecue there is out there. Who likes vinegar in their barbecue sauce anyway? So think about whether or not you're artificially restricting access to potentially enriching experiences by making judgments about what you think the student ought to be able to learn. It's easy for us to project our own personal values onto our students. And that's why the IDEA emphasizes, with great significance, parent participation in the process. Because we are the vehicles for what to teach. We are supposed to know what, we are the vehicles for knowing how to teach. We know teaching procedures, we know strategies, we know methods, we know how to collect data, we know how to make materials, spend our own money. We know how to do all that stuff. We do it on a Wednesday night in the middle of summer. We go and learn about how to be better teachers because you're dedicated to it. But what you value shouldn't be the thing that determines what your student is going to learn. That's a process of discussion and consideration with the curriculum standards. I meet with the parents, I talk about what they want for their child, what their hopes and dreams and goals are for their child, what they want their child to know and learn. I look at the curriculum standards and see what society says is important, and I try to bridge the gap between those things. That's my job as a teacher in designing a program. And then I set to work on teaching towards those expectations and outcomes. But we shouldn't be sitting at our computer the night before an IEP and thinking, I don't have a social skills goal. I better generate one, and just start, picking out whatever comes to mind about. Oh yeah, taking turns. That's good. Yeah, he needs to learn how to take turns. We shouldn't be doing that. It should be much more formal, much more thoughtful, much more deliberate process. We're talking about a person's life, and it's easy to lose sight of that. In the grind, the daily grind, it's easy to lose sight that your decisions have long-term implications for another person's life and all the other people involved in that person's life. So we should be very careful about deciding what to teach. All right? Let's select what ought to be taught based on what we know parents value, but also our knowledge of the curriculum standards for state standards or some other curriculum manual that you may be relying on or that you've been required to use. And select from that menu things to include in the IEP. All right. So how can they help? You can immediately broaden your expectations for students and broaden your daily teaching behavior. You may be stuck in a rut. You go to the standards and you think, we don't do much science. At least not in a sense that, science, I love science, so I think everybody should be doing science. I'm just like hardcore fan of science, scientific investigation, collecting data, learning things. I think, if I were a teacher, I would probably have many goals in an IEP related to science because that's my bias. You have to be careful about whether or not my personal bias starts to sort of obstruct the students' access to other things that they might find more valuable or interesting or useful. But if you go to those curriculum standards, you might think, we're not doing anything related to that. And you don't have to teach exactly what the standard is. You don't have to get performance exactly to what the standard describes, but that is something you can adapt and you can strive towards that. You can come up with something, you can be creative. That's where the art of teaching starts to get into the mix there. How can I get something related to this? I hope to show you some examples of that in a minute. The second benefit, I think, relates to student generalization. How many of you have had issues with or difficulties with or are concerned about generalization, student generalization? Yes, everybody. Like, so how do I teach this skill, but then they don't use it, or they don't apply it in this context? They're prompt dependent, maybe. Broadened curriculum can help enhance student generalization by making you teach in slightly different ways. There's two main ways to think about generalization. One is stimulus generalization, and that has to do with the same skill being used in various contexts. And response generalization has to do with variations of a skill in the same context. So like for stimulus generalization, maybe you have a student raising their hand to answer a question posed in a classroom, and then they learn to raise their hand to answer a question in the gymnasium or something, some other location. Same skill, different context. Maybe they start raising their hand, not to answer a question, but to ask a question. Okay, that is stimulus generalization. Response generalization has to do with, let's say, like a student learns to point to something, or is reaching for an object to gain access to it, and then begins to vocalize to gain access to that item. So the reach is happening first, but after the reach is effective, they also start to say, like say the B sound for bubbles. They see you have the bubbles, they reach and they start to say buh, buh, buh. That's response generalization. You get variation of what the person is doing, but in the same context. And if we can teach the same skills in multiple and varied contexts, we can promote generalization. If you're interested in that topic, you want to go and read about embedded instruction, where you take your IEP objectives and rather than having sit-down lessons and now it's time to do reading and then it's time to do writing and now it's time to do math, you actually take your math objectives and you ask yourself, how can I integrate this math objective in various ways throughout the schedule? So the student has multiple opportunities to practice the skill in various contexts throughout the day. It may take more trials to get to mastery, but once you get to mastery, oftentimes you're also at the generalization stage as well. And that is the benefit of embedded instruction, and curriculum standards can help you get there by thinking about how many objectives, how many performance standards or expectations can I pack into my morning meeting. When we're walking in the hall, what can I be teaching when we're walking down the hall? Those are teachable moments. Every minute of the day can be a teachable moment if you plan for it. And connecting to curriculum standards can help you do that. Now, there are multiple ways to go and find standards. There are multiple sort of resources. Assessments, like the Brigance, the Syracuse, I mentioned that one. That's an oldie but a goodie. You know Syracuse? That's a good one, man. I love that manual. You can get it on Amazon for a really good price. You have to deal with the archaic language, but it's still a very good manual. I'm not going to go into curriculum manuals tonight because I want to show you how to link to state standards. There are also consortiums, councils, national centers, other sort of authoritative sources for different standards. Probably the ones you're most familiar with are the Common Core, which comes from the Council for Chief State School Officers, and your State Department of Education. Those are usually where you find education standards. In Kansas, they're the same. So Kansas is one of the states that has aligned their standards with the Common Core. There is a center. I'm not affiliated with the center, and I have to say I'm no expert in dynamic learning maps. We have folks at KU who are, and that's their baby, and they've spent a lot of time and done a lot of research on DLM, but the dynamic learning maps have been aligned with the state standards, which means they're also aligned with Common Core. So you sort of have an option. You can go to the DLM, the dynamic learning maps, or you can go to the state standards. So what are dynamic learning maps? There are these, if you think about teaching as like going down a path or a road with stopping points along the way, and we're sort of progressing towards a goal, and you got to learn this before you can learn that, and you got to learn that before you can learn this, and it's very sequential. That's sort of a traditional way to conceptualize, or a traditional model for conceptualizing student progress in education. You know, we have to teach A before B, and we have to teach B before C, and they have to know A, B, and C before we can get to D, and that sort of thing. But dynamic learning map sort of turns that on its head and says, actually, there are many paths, and they may have similar or different destinations, and students will follow or sort of develop in different ways, which is really intuitive when you think about special education. Like our students, they all don't go down the same path. And sometimes it's very difficult for us to try to force them in that linear way to progress prerequisite after another. So they provide multiple pathways. I like to think of it as highways. That's the analogy that they use, when I go home tonight, there's lots of ways that I can get to Shawnee. I can take the interstate, I can take highways, I can take 2-lane roads, I can get stuck behind a train, for 30 minutes. Apparently that's a thing here. But I can get there. I can get there in the different ways. I can take the scenic route or I can take the direct route. Same sort of logic with dynamic learning maps. They have aligned, the DLM folks, they have aligned the dynamic learning maps with the state standards for English language arts, math, and science. So there's no dynamic learning map for social studies, so you'll have to go to the Kansas, you have to go to the department website to get the folder that I gave you to get the standards for social studies, government, and history. Right? This is a very hard to see example of DLM, so I'm going to see if I can get out of here and show you. Oh, so now gestures are not working. Oh, I see. I gotta look over here. Boom. No. Here. So they have these the F that you see, which is on a lot of these little like standards areas, stands for foundation. So these are like foundational skills the student must acquire or master prior to moving on to different nodes in the map. But you can see here that, so it makes sense then to have notice what is new and recognize same and different as foundational skills, because discrimination of stimuli is necessary for learning practically everything. So that's a beginning point. But after that, there's different directions to go. If the person notices what's new, you can then move on to teaching them to recognize something different. Or if you know they can recognize same, you can move on to going maybe towards lessons on attributes. If they're paying attention, which is, I would argue, maybe that's more important or more foundational, but attention is here, and there's different directions that you can go. And this map is quite large. This is just the third grade through 5th grade map. You'll see that some of these are blue. Those stand for the English language arts standard. So that's tied to a state standard. It's related to a state standard for English language arts. So you have a path to get to this standard. You have multiple paths to get to that standard. And you might say, okay, well, what can my student, maybe I'm writing present levels and I can look at this map and I can see, oh, my student can do all these foundational skills. What makes good sense in terms of next steps? They have these maps for 3rd through 5th grade. They have them for middle school. They have them for high school. They have them for English language arts, for math, and for science. Okay, so let's look at just some of these curriculum manuals here. Is that one? No, that's a map. Let's start with math. So you can go to the State Department and you can get this, download this document. It's the math standards. They're hyperlinks, so you can go, let's say, go to grade 4, and now you have these different categories, and all you really need to do to be able to align your IEP goals with state standards is just spend a little bit of time getting familiar with the standards. It's not a lot of work. It may seem like you're going to have to, churn through all this information and figure it all out, but if you just start with math, what are the math standards? Well, I will say one barrier, I think, is the fact that all these standards are separate. So math has its own thing and it's designed in its own way, and that's different from ELA, which has its own 500-page document. Man, those people they love their standards in that content area. Science is very different. It uses the next generation science standards, and there's all this other stuff. So the documents look really different. I'll show you, but so that can be a bit of a barrier. That may slow you down, but just start with one. Go to your grade level for your student, and just get familiar with these. So we have, algebraic thinking. I don't know, I clicked on this earlier, I guess. So here are the standards as they relate to math for fourth grade. There's like these different categories: observation, operations and algebraic thinking, OA, numbers, operations in base 10, and they have these little acronyms. Make a little cheat sheet for yourself, maybe. And if you have a goal written, then you can just sort of go through here and see how does it relate to the standard. Or you could work in the opposite direction and say, here are some interesting and useful, math standards. These are some things we can work toward. Let me write some goals based on those standards. Either way, I think is okay. Keeping in mind that you're considering the student's strengths, preferences, interests, and weaknesses, and parent input, what they think their student or their child ought to be able to do or know or learn. So that's math. Build fractions, that's easy. We can do that during mealtime. We do fractions during mealtime, that's an easy one. But maybe I can, if I'm doing embedded instruction, I can try to find other ways to do fractions throughout the day. Half the line goes first, half the line stays behind, that sort of thing. I mean, you just get real creative. Think about how to relate to your standard. Solving problems, that's every person's life. You can relate almost any goal to problem solving. Sometimes you have specific problem solving goals for your students. If you have a fourth grade student, solve problems involving measurement, conversions of measurement from larger to smaller units. You can think about some practical way to get the student to solve a problem about having less and more. You can contrive a situation where I give one student, 2 or 3 scoops of popcorn, and I give this one student who I'm trying to teach to ask for more and understand the differences between, the amount given and how to solve that problem. Maybe I only give them like 3 kernels, and then I sort of I have some teaching strategy. I know what I want him to do. And maybe I have a prompter. Maybe he has a communication device or system. And he's going to say something like, I only have 3, or I need more, or that's not fair, something like that. I can relate that to the standard, and I'm doing that during snack time. Not hard to do this sort of thing. I think when you get in the habit of connecting standards to your IEP goals, your creative juices will get going, and you'll start thinking, well, how could I do this during morning meeting or during lunch or while on the playground? Maybe I have a bus, para who's riding the bus with the student, and that's an opportunity. What could we do for problem solving in that situation? So those are the math standards. Whoops. And this is how they look on the dynamic learning maps. And maybe this is more your cup of tea. They've broken these down into what they call major claims. So then they've numbered them: major claim 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. And then they have the conceptual area. Understand number structures. Compare, compose, and decompose numbers and sets. These are just the performance standards. You can relate them to your students' IEP goals. Here they are for grade 3. So if you just go to your grade, let's say you got a student in 4th grade, here are your essential elements for math. And these are the sorts of things that are assessed on the state alternative assessment. So you may choose any standard from this manual or collection, because all of those are being tested for all students in the district, sans those who are on the alternate assessment. The specific targets for the alternative assessment are these. But don't limit yourself don't teach to the test. That's the temptation, like, oh, those are the things that are gonna make my student look like I'm doing a good job. Because now we're hitting these, we're making progress. Don't be confined by the assessment itself. That's temptation to avoid. The other standards, and again, these are all in the Dropbox. Here are the government and history standards for social studies standards. They have them by grade. Let's go at 4th grade, page 40. Fourth grade. So choices have consequences. Huh! I wonder how I could relate some IEP goals to that. That's an easy one. You may have multiple IEP goals that you're like, oh, that's one of those special standards that can be applied in multiple unique and useful ways, right? Individuals have rights and responsibilities. Question? Yes. No, you're fine.
So would you list that standard under multiple goals, even, or multiple standards under a goal?
You could do that. Oftentimes we're constrained by the documents themselves. So the documents will maybe only allow you to a certain amount of space. I'm not sure what the IEP software is like in Kansas because I've not used it before, but in Nevada, they had this goal bank and they were all tied to the standards. So it was just like this, it was just an automated process. So you could just click on a goal, and I didn't like it because it was this very generic and not very accountable system. But and then it would automatically populate the related standard for that goal.
Yeah, no, we can
You have to
come up with a goal, and then we have to find, then we're searching like.
find a standard for it to meet. Yeah.
Support it.
I think it's okay to use, like repeatedly use a standard that actually relates to the goal, but I would be careful about overusing that standard for everything.
Well, I was just thinking like that, what was it? Choices have consequences could be related to more than one goal on the IEP possibly.
Sure.
And so would you list it both, even though you might have another standard that you were intending to hit with that goal?
Yeah. What I might do is like, let me just, I have a slide where I show like a situation where there are two standards that can be useful for a goal. And you sort of have to decide if you want to use both of those or choose one that makes the most sense. So I think it's sort of a logical decision based on fitness, like how well does this standard fit with this goal? Or sometimes it might be, well, I've already used that one twice, so maybe I better try to tie it to something that's a little bit different so I don't look like I'm only teaching to one standard, even if it relates. Because the reality is, a goal could meet or be consistent with several different standards.
Right.
Reading, like the PECs, for example, that could be communication, reading, social skill. I mean, you could relate it to, different standards because that behavior, that skill is dynamic. It has multiple reasons and can relate to multiple standards. But generally, I would say pick the best one. Good question. Let's see here. That is government. Nope, that's bit.ly. I must have something hidden. Yeah, ELA. I thought I had the dynamic learning maps version of this up here, but I'll just show you quickly. I would recommend you use the dynamic learning maps version of the ELA standards. I'm sorry, this is very counterintuitive because this is really lengthy. But if we just go to, of course, it's not going to work. This just goes on and on. We're still in kindergarten. Still in kindergarten.
Imagine that, a language-heavy document from the language.
From the language people, right? We're still in kindergarten, and we're on. The pages are not numbered. Imagine that. Language people without page numbers. Yeah, I'm sorry, my arrow is just uncooperative. Well, you get the idea. Yes.
Can you put DLM standards on an IEP version that does not take the DLM?
Oh, that is a good question. I don't know. A student who's not on taking the alternative assessment. I would caution against that.
Right.
I would suggest that you find the related state standard
Yes.
that was used by the DLM folks
Well, I
and
was
use that one
questioning
instead.
because you said use that one versus the other ones, I just didn't know.
How many, are most of the students with autism taking the state alternative assessment? No, very small, less than 1%, I think is like the rule.
Yep.
Yeah. So if your student is not taking the alternative assessment, then you probably should, you could use the DLM as a quick reference, but trace it back to the actual state standard and use that one instead. That's a good point.
I'm just confused because I'm aware that you could do that, but I was just confused.
I appreciate your help. Yes.
I've got a weird question. I give the DLM and I work off of essential elements.
Uh-huh.
And I've got kids that are like distal and proximal and
Right.
is there anywhere where they break those essential elements down even further?
I have not found that.
Because that would be so helpful for me.
Yeah, I understand. I think that so the maps with the first tier sort of foundational skills, even those sometimes are a bit inconsistent. Like, to me, attention would be above discriminating or noticing that something is new or different. Because if you're not attending, then how can you notice that something has changed? So the structure of this is, I would say, very fluid, and you could probably jump around a little bit, but once you hit, there's like a foundational level, and once you get there, you have to sort of piece together what is it, some students with very severe disabilities, getting them to attend is a lot of work. Getting them to lift their head, to orient their face, to look in a particular direction. It's hard to relate standards to that. I don't know, am I answering your question?
I mean, it just seems like, I've got kids who are pre-academic and functional is
Mm-hmm.
not an option.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's hard for me to, when I write goals, to break it down to kind of, because it's all math related or reading related. And so how do I say I just want an easy way to say, like, he's able to label pictures, or he's able to use, sign language to label something, or he's able to imitate a gross, like, verbal behavior stuff. How do I tie that to
Yeah.
essential elements?
This, I think, gets back to the difficulty in reconciling the emphasis on academic standards and performance, which is a product of the standards-based reform movement, No Child Left Behind, and what you might consider functional or useful skills for the individual. So at some level, we have to acknowledge that, algebra, algebraic equations don't really have any bearing on this student's education because the student is still learning how to communicate, has some very, needs some very basic skills. In that sense, you probably need to be very creative and think about, okay, well, if I'm trying to teach communication and the grade standards in math are about algebraic equations, we're talking about, same and different, more and less, and how can we get this person, we can relate it to that and get this person to ask for more when they don't have as much or they've run out of something that they want. But if you can explain and justify that decision, then I think you're okay.
Be spending hours there, like, how can I break this down?
What does it say at the top? What is the little, say at the top?
Maybe I just need to.
What are those two little orange goldy boxes?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the picture is,
Those aren't necessarily the top one.
yeah.
Noticing something.
That particular thing.
But if you look at attend is everything points away from attend. So that is the foundation.
Oh, yes,
You know, and then you follow the arrows away.
that's a good point.
They're saying that they should go all the way down to the earliest learning awareness. They address awareness, orientation. I think somewhere in there they do.
And this is their lowest map is for grade 3 through 5. Maybe in other states, because that's where there's alternative assessment.
Early learning, early childhood, but you can't use that if they're in third grade.
I'm not sure I'm following the question or the concern.
What she wants is up there, they're in those items.
So if they're in those, yeah, you're right, like a 10, but what is like F62, what state standards is that?
Which one?
What do the numbers mean? Like how can I
F2?
tie that to a standard?
Those are just arbitrary numbers that they've assigned to all of the different skills, yeah.
So if you looked on the DLM, they would list and it would say up to recognizing same.
Yes.
And they're in a sequence of,
Yes, and they have an Excel sheet that has all of them in, yeah, sure.
And all they're saying is that, if your inclination is to go from oriented to custom, I mean, they're saying there's different ways to proceed from
Yes.
one box to another box.
Yes,
And so you don't have to go in a certain order, but they do get down to some of the very basic skills that you're trying to teach.
DLM needs to do a webinar on this.
they have a lot of stuff online.
I've seen a lot of those.
And I have to apologize because this is not in my, like, I am not a DLM person, it's not in my wheelhouse, so I don't.
Sorry to bring that up.
No, it's okay. I'm okay with admitting, I know the limits of my knowledge, and I have to say, like, the DLM is not, that's not something, a project that I was involved in. I have an understanding of what they've done and how they've tried to relate, an alternative assessment and how they've related that to the state standards. But I don't have all of the details about how they developed it and what's the, what to do in that specific circumstance. Lee?
A resource that we are on target to create over the next year is linking the essential elements to the VB map.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, there are people in the back that are really excited about that because we got Mary Pat and Janine will be linking those standards to that assessment as a way to help those of you who use the DLM to make it more meaningful and be able to collect data that demonstrates progress or no progress, then we need to
Right.
come up with a different teaching strategy.
Yeah, and
So,
keep in mind also that the standards are not a curriculum. They're called curriculum standards, but you're designing the curriculum based on your students' needs. It's a menu, right? So you think these are the standards that I'm trying to meet, but they're not necessarily what I'm teaching, and they're absolutely not how I'm teaching. They're just relating them to the standards, what you're teaching and relating it to the standard. Question? So-
yeah, if you're ready to move on to another kind of topic, I have another question about the regular state common core state standards.
Okay. I'll take that question. There's no Rotten Tomatoes involved in that question, I hope.
I wanted you to finish, if we're done with that, but,
Yeah, I was going to move on to, just highlight, I've already went over this, but the different domains of standards and,
yeah, which is actually kind of leads into my question, because the motor skills, which is often what I'm writing goals about, because I'm the occupational therapist, and I'm working on the visual coordination, like they cannot track, they cannot fixate, and they're in third grade, and I'm trying to be like, okay, how is it, there is in like language arts where they might be writing, there's nothing, I mean, it is really extrapolated out to try and relate visual fixation to,
sure.
because the standards for writing are really related to content, not the physical production of it.
Right.
And so I generally put NA, but I've never figured out how to really link the state standard to anything I would be working on, and is that appropriate or not appropriate?
I think there's two things to think about here. One is, relating to a standard, and the other is explaining or justifying that relationship. So what you're talking about is very prerequisite skill. It's like way down the line for this current
Like it would be
standard
a
of
DLM
performance.
functional skill, skill, but they're
Yep.
really third grade doing general ed curriculum.
Yep. And so if you identify that standard and link to that standard, and then I say, well, why did you link to that standard? And you can give me an explanation that's defensible, then I think you're fine. That's what accountability is. It's about,
Pretty tough to do though.
it is tough to do, but I think reasonable people will understand that if you're linking to a grade level standard and you have a student with, is learning some very basic skills, you're not saying that you're going to get to that standard. You're saying that this skill is related to that standard. And that's the point to make. You're not trying to teach that to that standard. You're not saying that the students should be able to do this by the time this IEP expires. What you're saying is, I'm teaching this skill, and here's the reason why I'm teaching that skill. And you can relate it to your assessment results, your knowledge and expertise as an occupational therapist. Yep, you can do that all day long. It's just one more little detail to say, and here's why it's relevant in an educational setting. This is why this skill is important, or how we're trying to work towards that particular skill. There are these different domains, and I like to think of, separate these two out. I think it's much more easy to relate to academic standards when you're teaching or writing academic goals. It may be much more difficult to identify goals for non-academic standards because they're not explicitly provided by the state. So you're not going to find curriculum standards for communication or adaptive daily living skills or transition in employment and so on. But you can relate them. And you can do this is a process that I recommend you follow. You first retrieve and examine the standards so you have some basic understanding of what those standards include, and you might use the DLM if you have a student on alternative assessment, or you might use the state standards if the student is not eligible for the alternative assessment. Formulate your goals based on the present levels and the curriculum standards, and obviously parental input. And think about how you might go to the standards to develop goals. It's sort of that two-way street I mentioned earlier. Consider that you might have multiple goals for one academic area. You're oftentimes going to have multiple goals for one particular functional domain. You might have 2 or 3 communication-related goals, for example. Make sure that there's consistency in your logic, present levels. If you have a goal for something, you need the present levels there. Every present level should inform a goal, or every goal should be informed by a present level. And you should identify what sorts of ancillary services, how much time, all of those details are necessary to achieve that standard. That's how you're designing your educational program for this student. So if you get to the end of that process and you discover that you have 800 minutes per week blocked out for ELA for a student who's in a self-contained classroom but only one goal with 3 objectives, that's a lot of time allocated to that one goal and three related objectives. Conversely, if you have a student who you're allocating 100 minutes per week, 100 minutes per week for social skills instruction, but you have 4 goals and 16 objectives, how does that work? And maybe that's okay if the way you conceptualized it, but there should be some logic there, some consistency. It should make sense. So let's just do a couple or a handful of examples. Let's look at math. Maybe we have a student whose goal says answer WH questions about text read aloud by an adult. Obviously that can fit in the ELA domain. So I go to my, oops, that's not supposed to be there. I go to my standards, and oh, what happened here? I got mixed. There we go. Sorry, the slides are slightly out of order. And I go to grade 4 for the student, and I find the standard. It says report on a topic or text, tell a story, or recount an experience in an organized manner using appropriate facts and relevant descriptive details to support main ideas or themes. Speak clearly and at an understandable pace. Well, that makes good sense for answering it's a perfect standard for my WH question. All right. Maybe I have a math goal, which is to identify coins. And in 4th grade, wouldn't you know it, there is a specific standard that relates exactly to that. I just got lucky when I did that one. Serendipity. I thought they taught coins earlier than that. I seem to remember my 2nd grade daughter learning these things, but that's the standard. Identify coins, penny, nickel, dime, quarter, and their values. So that's an easy one.
So what if he's in high school?
What if the students, then we got to go to look at those high school standards and see how can we relate. One thing I would like caution about is if you're teaching the label of coins in high school, I don't know, you have to answer that question, like, is that a good use of the student's time?
If you can't do it.
But do you have to know the names of the coins to spend the money, to make a purchase?
And in reality, how often is that particular student going to be using coins to make purchases? From a practical standpoint, when I go to the store, I never use coins, so to speak.
Well, yeah, it depends on,
Yeah,
it
it doesn't,
depends. He has a job, he gets paid cash. He needs to know what that is, but he doesn't, in high school, he doesn't know it with the shop.
Can you count dollars?
Yes, we can do that. Dollars are easy.
So then you can do like the dollar up strategy where you just teach them to round up to the next dollar, and that you should be in the, that much is how much you should get or how much you have to pay. It's sort of like the tying your shoes thing, right? It's like, well, yeah, it's okay to spend time, I think, we can spend time on a 1st grader or 2nd grader trying to teach that kid how to tie his shoes. But if he's in 12th grade, should we be spending 30 minutes a day on that? Probably not. So this is a matter of identifying your priorities. Like, what is the value of teaching coins to a 12th grader? Teaching the names of the coins. Does a kid need to be able to say that's a quarter in order to spend money or to keep track of his money? That's what you sort of have to wrestle with, and that's your goal selection. There probably aren't many money-related goals in a 12th grade standard, so you're going to have to make that stretch where you're talking about arithmetic of some sort and relating it to that standard. But in that case, it's just a matter of accountability and justifying your decision to relate it to that. Well, this is why we chose that standard. Yes, it's very much down the line from where we are today, but that's the standard that relates to this goal. In science, maybe we have a goal to discriminate between hot, warm, cool, and cold temperatures. Seems like a relevant, pretty useful skill for a 4th grader to learn. I can go to my science standards, and in the 4th grade standards for science, make observations to provide evidence that energy can be transferred from place to place by sound, light, heat, and electric currents. So that doesn't sound exactly like discriminating between different temperatures, but it relates to it. I mean, you only have so many standards to choose from. So you have to relate it to the standards that are available. In science, these are the 4th grade science standards for energy. And if we're talking about hot and cold, those are, products of energy. I'm going to relate it to that standard. It's just a matter of the logic. Again, you're not teaching, it doesn't mean that you have to teach these things, that energy can be transferred from place to place and so on and so on. It's just related to that standard. Here I am over here teaching this skill. It's related to this, grade level standard. Is that making sense? Kind of, sort of? Some people are starting to think, oh, maybe I don't really like this idea. Sometimes you might have objectives that overlap. So, like if we go to functional communication, using an AAC device to request a break. I'm going to start going a little bit fast because we're running out of time. I can find an ELA standard and a social studies standard that might relate to that. So in this case, I could have the ELA standard follows agreed upon rules for discussion and can carry out assigned roles, or the social studies standard, the student will recognize and evaluate significant choices made by individuals, communities, states, and nations that have impacted our lives and future. Prepare meals. So as a high school example, you can go to this DLM and solve real-world problems involving addition and subtraction decimals using models when needed. Preparing meals with a main course and 2 side dishes. What's that?
You could probably tie the coin one to that one, solving real world.
You can tie a lot of things to a lot of things. It's just a matter of, do you have a good rationale for it? It's not, it may seem like this is not a good use of your time, but it doesn't take a lot of time to tie it to a standard. We're demonstrating that we're teaching this, we know that the student can't perform or isn't expected to perform to a specific level. But we're relating what we're teaching to what the expectations are by the state as described in the curriculum standards. I know it's a hard sell, and it's difficult to convince you. I'm trying my best. Believe me, believe me. Functional transition and employment. Advocate for accommodations for employment settings. Teach a student to advocate for their accommodations. We can go to the social studies standards, find this standard in that document. The student will analyze the context under which significant rights and responsibilities are defined and demonstrated, their various interpretations, and draw conclusions about those interpretations. It's related. It's not, we're not teaching that standard, but it's related to that standard. Now, in relating those standards, or even starting with those standards to develop goals, you may be broadening what it is that you're thinking about teaching the student. Remember, this is about not just accountability, but making sure that you provide an adequate, comprehensive educational program that you might not otherwise provide had you not considered looking at the standards and designing a program based on what is expected to be taught. There are other sources for standards that I'm not describing tonight, like assessments, curriculum manuals, those sorts of things. And those can be very useful. Maybe you'll find better standards to relate to, but you should still have a state standard identified. Many states actually require you to identify the state standard for every IEP goal. All right, so this is just a matrix of all of the different goals and IEP goals and standards that we looked at. So there was a little bit in my description of tonight's talk about evidence-based practice. And so I just want to quickly cover that content because that's something I really think is important and I talk a lot about. An evidence-based practice is a set of procedures that have been found effective using high-quality research. And not just one study, but multiple high-quality studies. So it's about the quality of the evidence for a practice and the amount of evidence for a practice. So in that sense, you can think about a continuum of evidence. And I hear lots of euphemisms and terms to describe practices. We hear things like best practice, promising practice, emerging practice, evidence-based practice, research-based practice. There are lots of different terms, but I think best practice is one that sort of fits into the area of unknown. We're not quite sure. We tried this, we like it, but we're not quite sure if it's effective. You can use whatever euphemism you want there, but in the unknown area, it's generally a practice that's used because somebody liked it. They saw it on Pinterest and thought, oh, that's cute. I'm going to do that. There's ineffective practices. That means there's evidence that shows the intervention doesn't produce an effect, that it doesn't work. So that's an ineffective practice. There are also harmful practices. These are interventions that have demonstrated through evidence to be harmful to students. The obvious one I can think of is like facilitated communication. That's harmful because it prevents the student from actually expressing themselves. They're being treated like a puppet. And so that's a negative and harmful effect. We should not use that practice because the evidence shows that it is harmful. There are promising practices. Those are things that there's some evidence, some positive evidence for this, but not a lot of it, or the evidence is of low quality. Not every study is of high quality. Not every experiment is a good one. Just because it's published doesn't mean it's true. So you can go and find a journal article for anything these days, just because it's published doesn't mean it's true. It's the quality of the evidence and the amount of the evidence for that claim. So a promising practice is one in which there's some evidence to show that it could work, but we need more evidence before we feel confident that it will. A research-based practice means there's more studies, well-designed studies, and an effective or evidence-based practice means there are several high-quality experimental studies that show that this procedure will produce an effect. It's not guaranteed to produce an effect, but it's much more likely to produce an effect than all interventions that fall in all of these other categories, and therefore ethically superior, because it's less risky. Sort of a different way to think about this is this pyramid of evidence. So the lowest form of evidence is an anecdote or a testimonial. Oh, I did that, and that was really great. You should do this. Click here for testimonials from our users or our purchasers or previous customers. Expert opinion is just above that. Don't believe it because I say it, because I could be wrong. Just because I'm an expert doesn't mean I'm right. I think there's some convenience in accepting what experts say, especially when all of the experts or a large majority of them can converge on the same sort of opinion, or what we call consensus. But one opinion from one expert, especially if that person is inconsistent with the consensus, should not be considered trustworthy. All right? Low confidence, more doubt. An experimental study, you can have some confidence and some doubt. A systematic review, which collects a bunch of studies and analyzes the quality of those studies and says, here is a bunch of studies that used least to most prompts. That was an interesting debacle recently. Somebody came out with a paper that said there's not enough evidence for least to most prompts. And then like 2 weeks later, there was another paper that came out and said lots of evidence for least to most prompts. Different standards, different ways of evaluating the research. Those we call systematic reviews. And you can feel much more confident about an intervention when you see a systematic review that says, yes, this is a good intervention. And then meta-analyses is when they put all of the data from all of the studies together and they analyze those data as if it were one study to come up with an effect and an effect size. Tells us how much this intervention is likely to produce an effect or benefit the kid and how big that change will be. All right. When you see systematic reviews or meta-analyses of a study, you can feel pretty confident that it's a good practice. The same with curriculum. Don't reinvent the wheel. There are lots of places to go to get information about effective practices. These are just some of my favorites. There's this is a mouthful. The National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders, the NPDC, they have a list of 27 practices with protocols for application and how to use those interventions. They have a new website called Autism Focused Intervention Resources and Modules, where you can access freely online modules to learn about how to use these different practices. Functional communication training, PECS, functional behavior assessment, reinforcement, antecedent-based strategies, video modeling, self-monitoring, cognitive, or what some people call cognitive behavioral therapy, imitation, peer-mediated intervention, parent-implemented interventions. All of those have specific procedures, descriptions on how to do them, step-by-step guides, very easy to use and to learn these effective practices. You don't have to make stuff up to be an effective teacher. The National Technical Assistance Center on Transition also has a great amount of content on evidence-based practices for transition. They have lesson plans, materials, all sorts of information, and they've broken it down by evidence-based, research-based, promising, and unestablished practices. There's also the IRIS Center, which is an oldie but a goodie, and they keep updating it. Lots of information from Vanderbilt. This is a center at Vanderbilt. They give practice guides, procedures, modules, all sorts of information that you can access freely to learn how to implement different interventions. So, for example, I think a lot of you, if not everybody, who was at the Institute today, was working on, visual supports and structures and routine. The visual support itself is not the intervention, that's the material. The intervention is the use of that material using a set of procedures. How do you use the visual support? That's the intervention. Not just, you can't just have a schedule and that's an intervention. There are procedures for teaching the kid how to use that schedule. Visual supports is an evidence-based practice. Having the materials or having an iPad, just because a kid has an iPad doesn't mean that he knows how to communicate. An iPad is not an intervention. An iPad is a device, it is a medium, it is a tool. But just because somebody has access to a medium doesn't mean that they know how to use it. Just because you have a visual support doesn't mean that the student will understand what it means. So evidence-based practices are all about procedures, the steps you need to follow to implement an intervention. You may need materials, you may need equipment, you may need other resources, but it's the procedures that you need to learn about in order to be effective. And these resources will explain the procedures for any of those practices and more. And you don't have to invent anything. You don't have to design your own intervention. You can just pick and choose from the menu and then follow the steps. It's much more effective and efficient to do things that way. So, okay, I'm officially out of time. Lee?
With regard to, selecting those evidence-based practices and interventions, I think one of the things that we have to consistently remember is just because you can teach something using an evidence-based practice doesn't mean you should be teaching that if it's not a relevant skill, if it's not a relevant piece. And we can use an evidence-based practice with an individual student, but that doesn't mean that practice, our data will tell us whether or not that's an effective practice for that student. And because of that, we may go, you know what, this approach didn't work, but I've got 26 others that I can look at.
Yes.
And matching those things becomes really critical.
Yeah, an evidence-based practice is not guaranteed to be effective, and people don't really like when I say that. It's just the most likely to be effective compared to other interventions that have not been subjected to that level of scrutiny. So you need to pick the best practice from the menu based on what you know about the student, what they need to learn, how they learn, their strengths, interests, preference, and all of those things. But that doesn't mean you don't have to collect data. You don't just get to say, well, we're using PECS, so I don't need to collect data. PECS is evidence-based, so data collection is not required. You have to collect data to demonstrate that the child is responding to the intervention so that you know whether or not you need to increase the opportunities to respond or abandon the intervention and use something that's more effective or appropriate for the kid's needs. That's a good point. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I should be clapping for you. Thank you for coming to work on a Wednesday night in the summer. And most importantly, thank you for your dedication and service to children with autism and other developmental disabilities and their families. I really appreciate educators and special educators in particular, and I feel like I don't get to say that enough. So thank you, really. You can email me anytime. You wanted the spreadsheets. I'll try to get those. I need a pen. Can I borrow your pen?